wind is invisible. You cannot see it. You cannot hold it. You cannot point to it and say, there it is. You can only see what it does. You can see the grass bend. You can see the dust rise. You can see the hat leave a man's head and tumble across the prairie in a direction that no one would have predicted, because wind on the open plains does not behave the way it behaves between buildings or in a valley or anywhere that solid objects interrupt its path and give it edges that the human eye can follow. On the open plains, wind is a river without banks. It moves across the surface of the earth, the way water moves across the surface of a lake, in currents and eddies and waves that shift and merge and split apart with no warning and no pattern that a person standing in the middle of it can discern. The human body is not built for wind. A person can endure cold. A person can endure heat. A person can endure rain and snow and darkness and hunger and a remarkable range of physical hardships that would seem fatal in the abstract, but turn out to be survivable in practice. Wind is different. Wind attacks the body's ability to regulate its own temperature. At 20 degrees Fahrenheit on a calm day, a human being in a wool coat can stand outside for hours and remain functional. At 20 degrees Fahrenheit in a 30-mile-an-hour wind, the same human being in the same wool coat will lose core body temperature at a rate that produces hypothermia in under 40 minutes, because the wind strips the thin layer of warm air that the body maintains against the skin and replaces it with cold air faster than the body can warm a new layer. This is wind chill. The concept is simple. The effect is lethal. At 20 below zero in a 40-mile-an-hour wind, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. The wind does not need to be cold on its own. It only needs to move, and on the high plains of Wyoming territory in the 1880s, it moved constantly. The average wind speed in eastern Wyoming in winter is 18 miles per hour. This is an average. The gusts are worse. 30 miles per hour is routine. 40 is common during storms. 50 happens several times a winter, and when it happens, the world outside the cabin becomes a place where a person cannot stand upright, and livestock cannot be left in the open, and anything not anchored to the ground will be somewhere else by morning. The homesteaders who settled the high plains of Wyoming in the 1880s knew about the wind before they arrived. The railroad pamphlets mentioned it, usually in a sentence designed to minimize it, something about bracing breezes and invigorating air, the kind of language that a person sitting in an office in Omaha uses to describe a force that a person standing on the plains in January would describe using entirely different words. The pamphlets did not mention that the wind would strip the chinking from between the logs of a new cabin in the first winter. They did not mention that the wind would push snow through gaps smaller than a pencil and deposit it inside the cabin in drifts along the walls. They did not mention that the wind would take a sod roof that was not weighted properly and peel it back like the lid of a sardine tin. And they did not mention that the wind would kill livestock. Not by blowing them away, by freezing them. A cow standing in the open in a 30-mile-an-hour wind at 10 below zero is dead in 6 to 8 hours unless it can find shelter. And on the treeless plains of eastern Wyoming, there is no shelter. There are no trees to block the wind. There are no hills to break it. There are no valleys to hide in. There is only grass and sky and the wind owns all of it. A man who has never stood on the open Wyoming prairie in winter cannot understand this. He can read the numbers. He can calculate the wind chill. He can study the charts that show the relationship between air temperature and wind speed and the rate at which exposed flesh freezes. But he cannot feel it, and the feeling is the thing that matters, Because the feeling is what tells the body this is not a place where you can stay. And the body is right. Every homestead on the plains needed a windbreak. This was understood by everyone who lived there for more than one winter. The question was what kind of windbreak and how to build it. The obvious answer was a fence. A solid fence, tall and heavy, placed between the cabin and the prevailing wind. A wall of lumber or stone or sod that stopped the wind cold and created a pocket of calm air on the lee side where the cabin and the livestock could exist without the constant assault of moving air. This was the obvious answer, and it was wrong. A solid wall does not stop wind. A solid wall redirects wind. When a river of moving air hits a solid vertical surface, it does three things. It compresses against the face of the wall, building pressure. It accelerates over the top of the wall, increasing in speed as it crests the upper edge the way water accelerates over a spillway, and it curls back down on the lee side of the wall in a turbulent vortex that is often more destructive than the original wind, because the vortex concentrates the energy of the moving air into a smaller area and drives it downward toward the ground instead of across it. A solid 6-foot fence creates a zone of calm air extending approximately 6 to 10 feet on the lee side. Beyond that distance, the wind returns, and it returns with a turbulent downdraft that can be worse than the open wind because the vortex effect adds a vertical component that the original horizontal wind did not have. This is why solid board fences on the plains blew down. Not because the wind was too strong for the boards, because the turbulence on the lee side undermined the fence posts, rocking them back and forth in the ground until the soil loosened and the posts leaned, and the next strong gust folded the whole structure flat. The settlement of Willow Bench in eastern Wyoming territory was named for something that no longer existed there. The willows had been cut by the first homesteaders for firewood and fence posts, and the bench was a low, flat terrace above a seasonal creek that ran water in spring and dust in August. By 1888, Willow Bench was a community of 18 homesteads spread along the creek bottom and up onto the surrounding prairie, a mixed population of American-born settlers from Iowa and Missouri, a handful of Scandinavian families, and 2 Welsh families who had come to Wyoming by way of the slate quarries of Pennsylvania, where the pay was steady and the lungs were not. Rhodri and Saris Vaughan were the second Welsh family. They arrived in Willow Bench in the spring of 1887 after 3 years in the quarries at Bangor, Pennsylvania, where Rhodri had cut slate and Saris had kept house in a company row, and both of them had watched Rhodri's cough get worse every month until the doctor in Scranton told them plainly that if Rhodri stayed in the quarry dust another year, he would not see 40. They went west, not because they wanted to farm, because neither of them had farmed before. Because the air in Wyoming was clean and the land was free, and the cough got better within a month of leaving Pennsylvania, and Rhodri could breathe again, which was enough reason to stay, even if everything else about the place was terrible, and in many ways it was. Rhodri was not a farmer, he was a maker. In Ceredigion, before the quarries, he had been what the Welsh call a crefter, a craftsman, a man whose living came from the things his hands could shape from the materials the land provided. His father had been the same, and his grandfather before that. They made hurdles for sheep pens, wattle panels for garden walls, fish traps for the river, and every autumn they made the wind fences that went up on the exposed hillsides above the village where the sheep grazed through winter, and where the wind off the Irish Sea could kill a lamb in an hour if there was nothing between the lamb and the ocean. Rhodri had woven his first hurdle at 8 years old, kneeling beside his father on a hillside, while the rain blew sideways and his father's hands moved over the hazel rods with a speed and sureness that the boy tried to copy and could not yet, not for another 3 years of practice before his fingers found the rhythm and the rods began to obey. By 14, he could weave a standard 6x4 sheep hurdle in 3 hours. By 20, he could do it in 90 minutes, faster than his father, and his father said nothing about this. But his mother told Saris years later that the old man had been proud, quietly, in the way that Welsh hill farmers are proud of their children, which is to say without saying so. The quarries had taken the weaving away from him. 3 years of cutting slate in a pit where the air was gray with dust, and the light came from above, like light in a well, had stiffened his hands and coarsened his fingers and made him forget, not the knowledge, but the feel, the instinctive understanding of tension and bend, and the point at which a rod will crack if you push it a degree further. On the train west from Pennsylvania, he sat by the window flexing his hands and worrying that the craft was gone from them. It was not gone. It came back within a week of handling Willow, the way a musician's skill comes back after a layoff, rusty at first and then suddenly fluid, the hands remembering what the mind had not forgotten. The cabin went up in May of 1887, a log and sod structure built with help from Bram Pickett, a Missouri man who had homesteaded the quarter section to the north and who had been in the territory for 4 years and understood the basics of plains construction. The cabin was solid, the sod roof was thick, the cook stove drew well, and the wind came through the walls like the walls were not there. Not through the logs, through the chinking, through the gaps between the sod and the log ends, through the place where the stovepipe exited the roof and the sod did not quite seal against the metal, through every imperfection in the structure that would have been insignificant in a sheltered valley, but was critical on the open plains where the wind found every gap and exploited it with the patience and persistence of water finding its level. The first winter taught them. The second winter would have broken them if Rhodri had not known about fences. Not the kind of fences that the other homesteaders built. Not post and board fences, or post and wire fences, or sod walls. Those fences tried to stop the wind, and the wind broke them, or went over them, or curled around them, and the homesteads behind them suffered almost as much as homesteads with no fence at all. Rhodri knew about a different kind of fence. He knew about hurdles. In the hill country of central Wales, where Rhodri was born and where his family had farmed sheep for generations, the wind blew off the Irish Sea and up the valleys and across the bare hilltops with a force that was not as extreme as the Wyoming plains, but was constant and cold and had been shaping the way people built for 1,000 years. The Welsh response to wind was not to stop it, it was to slow it. A hurdle is a woven panel made of flexible rods, typically hazel or willow, interlaced between upright stakes in a pattern that creates a semi-permeable barrier. Semi-permeable is the key word. A hurdle is not solid. It has gaps. The wind passes through those gaps, but it passes through them slowly, broken into hundreds of small streams that lose their energy as they push through the tight weave of interlaced rods. The wind that emerges on the lee side of a hurdle fence is slower, calmer, and less turbulent than the wind that hit the face. There is no vortex. There is no downdraft. There is only a gradual reduction in wind speed that extends 20 to 30 feet on the lee side, 3 to 5 times the calm zone created by a solid fence of the same height. This is the principle that every modern agricultural windbreak is designed around. A barrier that is approximately 40 to 50% permeable reduces wind speed by 50 to 60% on the lee side and creates a protected zone extending 15 to 20 times the height of the barrier downwind. A 6-foot hurdle fence that is 45% permeable creates a zone of reduced wind extending 60 to 90 feet on the lee side, an area large enough to shelter a cabin, a livestock shed, a garden, and a working yard. A solid fence of the same height shelters approximately 10 feet. Rhodri did not know these numbers. He did not have a wind tunnel, or an anemometer, or a textbook on fluid dynamics. He had something better. He had 400 years of Welsh hill farming encoded in the pattern of his hands, a weaving technique that his grandfather had taught his father, and his father had taught him, sitting on a stone wall on a hillside in Ceredigion, on an afternoon when the wind was blowing so hard that the sheep were lying down in the lee of the wall rather than grazing, and his father had pointed at them and said, "See how they know where the calm is. We will put the calm where we want it." Ceres's contribution was the weave itself. Rhodri knew hurdle weaving. He had made sheep hurdles in Wales since he was a boy, simple panels of hazel rods woven between split oak stakes in a basic over-under pattern that produced a serviceable fence for penning sheep on sheltered hillsides. But a sheep hurdle in Wales was a temporary structure, moved every few days as the flock grazed across a field, and it did not need to withstand wind loads, anything like what the Wyoming plains would deliver. A basic over-under weave in a 40-mile-an-hour wind would flex and gap, and eventually the rods would work loose from the stakes, and the panel would come apart within a season. Ceres knew a different weave. She had learned it not from shepherds, but from basket makers. Her mother had been a basket weaver in the village of Tregarin, one of the women who made the heavy willow baskets that the farmers used for carrying everything from potatoes to coal. Baskets that had to hold 50 pounds without deforming and had to survive being thrown into wagons and dragged across stone floors and generally abused in ways that would destroy any structure held together by a simple over-under pattern. Her mother's weave was a diagonal, a technique called a twill in basket making, where each rod passes over 2 stakes and under one in a staggered pattern that locks each rod against the 2 beside it. In a basic over-under weave, each rod is held in place only by the friction of the stakes it wraps around. In a twill weave, each rod is locked by the rods above and below it, creating an interlocking matrix where every piece supports every other piece, and no single rod can work loose without the entire panel shifting. The twill weave was also tighter. The gaps between rods in a twill pattern are smaller than in a basic weave because the diagonal angle pulls the rods closer together, reducing the open area of the panel from approximately 55% to approximately 40%. 40% permeability is closer to the ideal for a windbreak, which modern research places between 35 and 50%. Too permeable and the wind passes through without losing enough energy. Too solid and the vortex effect returns. The twill weave put the panels in the sweet spot, permeable enough to avoid turbulence, tight enough to slow the wind by more than half. Rhodri understood the stakes and the placement. Ceres understood the weave. Together, they could build a windbreak that neither of them could have built alone. The willow was the first problem. Willow Bench had been named for the willows that once grew along the creek, but those willows had been cut to stumps by 1885, and the stumps were too old and too damaged to produce the long, straight rods that hurdle weaving required. Rhodri needed rods 6 to 8 feet long, pencil thick at the butt and whip thin at the tip, flexible enough to bend around the stakes without cracking, and strong enough to hold their shape under wind load after they dried. He found them 12 miles upstream, in a bend of the creek where the water pooled deep enough to sustain a stand of sandbar willow that had never been cut because it was too far from the settlement for anyone to bother hauling firewood from. The willows there were dense, healthy, growing in thick clumps of straight rods that shot up 8 to 10 feet in a single season. He cut 200 rods on the first trip, bundled them in sheaves of 25, and hauled them back to the homestead on a borrowed mule. He made the trip 4 more times during the summer and fall of 1887, accumulating over 1,000 rods in a pile behind the cabin, where they soaked in a shallow trench of creek water that Rodri dug to keep them flexible. Green willow bends, dry willow snaps. Every hurdle maker knows this, and every hurdle maker knows that the window between green and dry is narrow, approximately 10 days in warm weather, which meant that the weaving had to happen while the rods were still supple, and that any rods not woven within the window had to be re-soaked for 3 days before they could be used. The stakes were different. The stakes had to be rigid, strong, and rot-resistant because the stakes went into the ground, and the ground in Wyoming froze to a depth of 3 feet in winter, and the freeze-thaw cycle would destroy soft wood in 2 seasons. Rodri used cedar, not western red cedar, which did not grow in eastern Wyoming, but eastern red cedar, the tough aromatic juniper that grew in scattered stands along the creek bluffs, and that the other homesteaders used for fence posts because it resisted rot better than any other wood available on the plains. He split the cedar into stakes 2 inches thick and 4 inches wide, sharpened to a point at the bottom, 6.5 feet long. The 1/2 foot above the 6-foot fence height served as a cap that kept rain from soaking into the end grain of the stake and rotting it from the top down. 32 stakes per panel. Each panel was 12 feet long and 6 feet high. Rodri needed 15 panels to create the windbreak arc he had planned, a crescent-shaped barrier curving around the north and west sides of the cabin and livestock shed, open to the south and east where the wind was less frequent and less severe. 15 panels at 32 stakes each was 480 stakes. 15 panels at approximately 65 rods each was 975 willow rods. 1 man, 1 summer, nearly 1,000 rods and 500 stakes and 15 panels, each one woven by hand, rod by rod, using a technique that required both hands and a knee, and sometimes teeth, to hold the tension while the diagonal pattern locked into place. Bram Pickett watched the first panel go up in early September 1887. Pickett was a practical man who measured the value of labor in terms of what it produced, and who could not see how a wall of woven sticks was going to do anything useful on the open Wyoming prairie, where the wind regularly pushed over solid board fences and snapped telegraph poles, and once, during the winter of 1885, lifted an outhouse clean off its pit and deposited it 40 feet south of where it had stood. "You are weaving a basket," Pickett said, leaning on his fence rail and watching Rodri bend a willow rod around the stakes with both hands, his knee braced against the panel to hold the tension. "Yes," Rodri said. He did not elaborate. He was concentrating on the diagonal, threading the rod over 2 stakes and under 1, pulling it tight against the rod below, feeling with his fingers for the moment when the tension was right and the rod locked into the pattern and would not slip. "A basket will not stop the wind," Pickett said. "No," Rodri said, "it will not stop it. If you want to know what happened when a Welsh hurdle maker from the sheep country of Ceredigion brought 400 years of windbreak engineering to the most wind-blasted stretch of prairie in Wyoming territory, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from." The first panel was finished on September 4th, 1887. Rhodri set the stakes by driving them 18 inches into the ground with a wooden mallet, spacing them 4.5 inches apart, center to center, in a line that followed the curve he had marked on the ground with a plow furrow. The curve was important. A straight fence presents a flat face to the wind, and a flat face concentrates pressure at the center of the span, the way a sail concentrates force at its middle. A curved fence distributes the wind load across its entire length, each panel taking a share of the force proportional to the angle at which the wind hits it, and no single panel bearing the full brunt. This was another piece of Welsh knowledge that Rhodri did not think of as knowledge. He thought of it as obvious. Every stone wall on the Welsh hills curved, every hurdle line curved. You do not build straight into the wind, you build around it. Cerys wove beside him from the third panel onward. She was faster than Rhodri with the diagonal weave because the pattern was in her hands from childhood, from the thousands of baskets she had helped her mother make in the workshop behind the house in Tregaron. Her fingers found the over 2 under 1 rhythm without conscious thought, the way a knitter's fingers find the stitch pattern after the first few rows, and she could weave a full panel in 2/3 the time it took Rhodri, because she did not have to think about the pattern. She only had to think about the tension, which is the difference between a panel that holds its shape under wind load and a panel that bags and sags and eventually tears itself apart. Too tight and the rods crack when the wind flexes the panel. Too loose and the rods shift and the gaps widen and the permeability increases past the point where the fence slows the wind effectively. Cerys set the tension by feel, pulling each rod to the point where it sang against the stakes with a low hum when she plucked it, the same tension her mother had used for the heavy carrying baskets, tight enough to hold shape, loose enough to flex. Rhodri could not match this by feel. He had to test each rod with his thumb, pressing against it and judging the deflection, a slower process that produced good results, but not the effortless consistency that Cerys achieved with her hands alone. 15 panels went up between September and late October. The total material cost was $2.35. 80 cents for a new billhook blade from the general store in Cheyenne, purchased during a supply trip in August. $1.10 for heavy twine used to bind the rod bundles during transport from the upstream Willow stand. 45 cents for a pound of linseed oil that Cerys mixed with turpentine and brushed onto the finished panels as a preservative, a treatment that her mother had used on finished baskets and that would extend the life of the willow rods by 3 to 5 years by sealing the surface against moisture penetration and UV damage. Everything else was free. The willow came from the creek. The cedar stakes came from the bluffs. The labor came from 2 people who knew what they were doing and did it without wasted motion. $2.35 for a windbreak. Oswald Tully rode out to the Vaughan homestead on October 19th, 1887. Tully was the territorial stock inspector, a lean, serious man whose job was to ride the eastern Wyoming homesteads, cataloging livestock and assessing range conditions for the territorial government. He had been in the territory for 9 years, and he had opinions about fences the way a carpenter has opinions about nails, which is to say, specifically and without apology. He sat on his horse and looked at the 15 woven panels curving around the Vaughan cabin, and he said, "What is that?" "It is a windbreak," Rhodri said. He was splitting kindling by the cabin wall. He did not stop. "I can see through it," Tully said. "Yes. A windbreak you can see through is not a windbreak," Tully said. "It is a suggestion." Cerys, who was inside the cabin and could hear the conversation through the open door, smiled but did not say anything. She had heard this before. Her mother had heard it before. Every basket maker and hurdle maker in Wales had heard it from every person who believed that a wall was only a wall if it was solid. And every basket maker and hurdle maker in Wales knew that those people were wrong, and that they would learn they were wrong the first time a solid fence blew down and a woven fence stood. That first winter was an education, but not for the Vaughns. The Vaughns already knew what the fence would do. The education was for the settlement. November came with the first sustained winds, 20 to 25 miles per hour out of the northwest, steady for days at a time. The kind of wind that was not dramatic but was relentless, a constant push that leached heat from every cabin and livestock shed and human body that stood in its path. The Vaughan cabin sat behind the woven crescent, and the wind that reached the cabin wall was not the wind that blew across the open prairie. It was slower. It was quieter. It had passed through 975 willow rods woven in Ceres's diagonal pattern, and each rod had taken a fraction of the wind's energy, and the sum of those fractions was enormous. Rhodri stood outside the cabin on the lee side of the fence on a morning in late November, when the wind on the open prairie was gusting to 30 miles per hour, and he held up his hand and felt what he had felt 1,000 times on the hillsides of Ceredigion. The gentle push of slowed wind, a breeze where there should have been a gale, the air still moving, but moving at a speed that a man could stand in comfortably, that livestock could graze in, that a fire in a cook stove could draw against without the draft reversing every time a gust hit the chimney. He estimated the wind on the lee side at 8 to 10 miles per hour, a 60 to 70% reduction. The cabin burned less wood that winter. This was the simplest and most measurable proof that the windbreak worked, because firewood consumption is a direct function of heat loss, and heat loss on the plains is dominated by wind-driven convection through the walls and roof. Every homestead in Willow Bench burned between 4 and 6 cords of wood per winter, hauled from the creek bluffs or purchased from the wood seller in Cheyenne at $12 per cord. The Vaughns burned 2.5 cords. The difference was the windbreak. The reduced wind speed on the lee side meant that the rate of heat loss through the cabin walls was cut by more than half, which meant the cook stove did not have to work as hard to maintain temperature, which meant less fuel per day, which meant fewer trips to the bluffs and more hours available for other work, and a savings of approximately $18 to $20 in wood over the course of the winter, which was nearly 8 times the cost of building the windbreak. Ceres noticed the difference first, not by measurement, but by the cook stove. In November, before the fence panels were all up, she had to feed the stove every 40 minutes to keep the cabin above freezing when the wind was blowing hard. By January, with the full crescent in place, she fed the stove every hour and a quarter. The stove burned the same amount of wood per feeding. The difference was how fast the wind pulled the heat out of the cabin. Behind the fence, the heat stayed. It soaked into the sod walls and radiated back, and the cabin felt, for the first time since they had arrived in Wyoming, like a place that was holding its warmth rather than fighting to replace it. The livestock survived better too. The Vaughns had 2 horses and 4 cows, modest stock for a Wyoming homestead, sheltered in a sod-roofed shed behind the cabin that was inside the windbreak arc. The shed was crude, 3 walls and a roof with the open side facing south away from the prevailing wind. In every other homestead in Willow Bench, the livestock sheds were battered by wind that found the open side regardless of which direction it faced, because the wind on the plains shifted constantly, and a shed open to the south was open to the north the next day when the wind changed. Inside the Vaughan windbreak, The wind shift did not matter because the crescent blocked the wind from every direction except due south and due east, which were the mild directions. And the livestock stood in relative calm, regardless of where the wind was coming from. Bram Pickett lost a cow on January 8th, 1888. A young heifer that he had left in the open paddock behind his cabin because the shed was full with his other stock. The wind was 35 miles per hour out of the northwest, and the temperature was 8 below zero, and the heifer was dead by morning, standing upright, frozen stiff, her eyes still open. Pickett found her at dawn, and he stood in the wind looking at his dead cow, and he did not swear or shout or kick anything. He went inside and sat at the table and drank a cup of coffee, and then he walked to the Vaughn homestead, which was a quarter-mile south across the open prairie, and he stood on the lee side of the woven windbreak and felt the air on his face, which was calm and still, and did not cut his lungs the way the open wind did, and he looked at the Vaughn livestock standing placidly in their shed behind the fence, and he said to Rodri, "How long does it take to weave one of those panels?" 2 days for one person, Rodri said. 1.5 days for two. "Teach me," Pickett said. Rodri looked at Saris. Saris came out of the cabin with a bundle of soaked willow rods and set them on the ground beside the nearest panel. She said, "Watch my hands." The spring storm of April 11th, 1888, was the proof that could not be argued with. It came from the northwest at dusk, and it built through the night into a sustained gale that the Territorial Weather Station in Cheyenne recorded at 53 miles per hour, with gusts to 68. This was not the worst storm in Wyoming history. It was not even the worst storm that year, but it was the worst storm that the settlement of Willow Bench had experienced since its founding, and it hit a community that was still building, still learning, still discovering the ways in which the open plains could punish a structure that was not designed for wind. 5 roofs failed that night. Not 5 roofs blew off. 5 roofs were damaged severely enough to require rebuilding. The Selby homestead lost its sod roof entirely, the wind lifting the sod layer from the plank sheathing beneath and peeling it back in a single mass that landed 30 feet behind the cabin. Idris Selby and his wife Maud were inside when it happened, and the sound was not a crack or a snap, but a long, slow tearing, like canvas ripping in slow motion, and then the cold came in from above, like a door opening in the ceiling, and they could see the sky where the roof had been, dark gray and full of driving rain and debris. The Crane homestead lost half its roof, and the chimney, the wind finding the gap where the stovepipe exited the sod, and widening it until the entire north side of the roof lifted and folded back. Bram Pickett's livestock shed, which was a 3-walled structure with a plank and sod roof, lost the roof and the north wall. The wind hitting the open south face and building pressure inside the shed until the weakest surface, which was the back wall, blew outward, and the roof, now unsupported on one side, lifted and broke apart. His remaining livestock stampeded into the dark, and it took 2 days to find them all, scattered across the prairie downwind in a ragged line. 2 other homesteads sustained damage to roofs, doors, and outbuildings. The Wick family losing their root cellar door and half their stored vegetables to the wind and rain that poured in through the opening. Nobody was killed, but 3 horses panicked and broke through fencing and were found 2 miles south of the settlement the following morning, shivering and dehydrated. The Vaughn homestead was undamaged, not slightly damaged, not damaged but repairable, undamaged. The cabin stood whole. The sod roof was intact. The livestock shed was intact. The 2 horses and 4 cows were inside the shed, calm, eating hay. The wattle fence had flexed in the wind the way it was designed to flex, the willow rods bending and springing back, the diagonal weave distributing the load across every rod and every stake simultaneously so that no single point bore more force than it could handle. 3 of the 15 panels showed minor loosening, where individual rods had shifted position under the extreme load, but the panels were intact and functional, and the loosened rods could be retightened in an hour with a mallet and a wedge. The fence had not stopped the 68-mile-per-hour gusts. Nothing stops 68-mile-per-hour gusts. The fence had slowed them. It had taken the energy of the wind and distributed it across 975 flexible rods, and each rod had absorbed a fraction of that energy and flexed, and the wind that passed through was diminished, and the wind that reached the cabin was not 68 miles per hour, but approximately 25 to 30, which was strong but not destructive, which was manageable, which was the difference between a roof that stayed and a roof that did not. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because these are the engineering solutions the history books forgot, and every share means one more person discovers what was possible with willow and weave and the memory of wind. Oswald Tully returned to the Vaughan homestead on his spring inspection ride in May. He sat on his horse and looked at the wattle fence standing complete and whole around the cabin after a winter that had damaged or destroyed structures across the territory. He looked at his inspection book where he had written, on his last visit, woven brush fence, temporary, value nominal. He crossed it out. He wrote, woven windbreak, permanent, assessed value $8. Then he looked at Rhodri and said, I need one of those at the stock inspection station in Cheyenne. Rhodri said, talk to Saris, she is faster. This was not modesty, it was fact. Saris could weave a 12-foot panel in a day and a half, working alone. Rhodri took 2 days for the same panel. The difference was the diagonal, which Saris's fingers understood from the inside out, the way a pianist's fingers understand a chord progression, the pattern so deep in her muscle memory that she could weave and talk and watch the horizon and never lose a rod or miss a crossing. Rhodri had to concentrate. He had to watch his hands. He had to count the crossings, over 2 under 1, over 2 under 1, and if someone spoke to him at the wrong moment, he lost his place and had to back out 3 rods and start the section again. This did not bother him. He was a good weaver. Saris was a great one, and the difference between good and great in handcraft is not skill, but fluency, the ability to work without thinking about the work. And that fluency came from Saris's mother and her mother's mother and the generations of basket women in Tregaron, whose hands had shaped willow into functional art for longer than anyone could remember. By the end of the summer of 1888, Rhodri and Saris had helped 4 other homesteads in Willow Bench build wattle windbreaks. The Pickett homestead, which Bram built himself with coaching from Saris on the diagonal weave. Pickett was a fast learner, but an impatient one, and in the first hour he cracked 4 rods by pulling them too tight around the stakes, forcing the bend instead of feeling for it, muscling the willow instead of guiding it. Saris stopped him. She took the rod from his hands and held it up and bent it slowly between her fingers and said, "Feel where it wants to go. The rod has a grain. If you bend with the grain, it bends forever. If you bend against the grain, it breaks." Pickett looked at the rod. He looked at his hands. He tried again, slower this time, and the rod bent cleanly around the stake and locked into the diagonal without cracking. He did not crack another rod that day. The Selby homestead, where Maud Selby insisted on learning the weaving herself and became, by the end of the summer, nearly as fast as Saris, her hands finding the same intuitive rhythm that Saris had learned from her mother, the two women working side by side on a panel one afternoon and falling into a synchronized pattern where one wove while the other fed rods, and they switched without speaking, the way two musicians switch parts in a duet they have played many times. The Crane homestead and the Wick homestead, both built by Rhodri working with hired help, while Saris supervised the weave tension and rejected any panel where the rods did not hum at the right pitch when she plucked them. The cost per windbreak ranged from $2 to $3.50, depending on how far the Willow had to be hauled. The time per windbreak was 10 to 18 days for two people, depending on the size of the crescent and the skill of the weavers. The standard design was a crescent of 12 to 15 panels sheltering the cabin and primary outbuildings from the north and west. By 1890, 9 of the 18 homesteads in Willow Bench had Wattle windbreaks. The settlement's average winter firewood consumption had dropped by approximately 35%. Livestock losses to exposure, which had averaged 4 to 6 animals per winter across the settlement before the windbreaks, dropped to 1 in the winter of 1889 and 0 in the winter of 1890. The fences were not beautiful. They were not the clean white post and rail fences that settlers from the east imagined when they thought about farming. They were dark, rough, woven walls of willow and cedar that looked, to anyone who did not understand them, like a basket turned inside out and stuck in the ground. But they worked. They worked because they did not try to stop the wind. They worked because they understood that you cannot stop the wind on the open plains any more than you can stop a river by standing in front of it. You can only slow it. You can only take its energy and distribute it across 1,000 flexible points that each absorb a fraction and pass the rest through in a form that is gentler, calmer, and compatible with the survival of the people and the animals and the structures on the other side. The fence did not fight the wind. It breathed it. No myths, no miracles, just willow, weave, and the memory of wind.